I'm Chaz Kolenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chaz4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kolenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Ken Timmerman, author, reporter, political activist, former congressional candidate, who is now out with a new book, which is not exactly what I personally expected, but which I am sure you will enjoy and find shocking and delightful and very thought-provoking. Ken, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's been crazy with the book tour and all the work related to the promotion, but I don't think a story like that needs much promotion. I think it speaks for itself.
Thank you, Irina. Thanks for having me on.
For many of my readers, your work, many of my listeners, your work may be new. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into reporting and in that particular area, and your other books? Tell us a little bit about them as well.
Sure, Irina. I've been an investigative reporter for 40 years at a time when that was still an honorable profession. It's no longer the case. Obviously, we can look around at the New York Times, which I worked for in the 1980s, or Time Magazine, which I worked for in the 1990s. These are, well, Time Magazine has ceased to exist, but the New York Times has become the communications directorate of the Democrat National Committee, as has CBS, which I worked for, ABC News, which I worked for, and a host of other publications. And this is unfortunate. This is unfortunate. So in my new book, And the Rest is History, I tell stories of my personal life, not of my life as a reporter, but the stories behind the news. I've written 11 other books of nonfiction, books about Iran, books about Iraq, books about the arms trade, about the French relationship with the United States, the French betrayal of America, even a biography of Jesse Jackson. And these were all books of investigative reporting. So these were journalistic investigations where I set out facts, I present documents, I do interviews with sources, and I don't really tell a lot about my own interaction with these people. I tell the stories pretty straight. This new book is a memoir. So it is, and it really is a memoir about two different things. It's a memoir of stories behind my reporting trips to the Middle East. My work as a war correspondent, in particular in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, among other places. And then it's also a story of a personal journey where I start out, and you can see this on the cover of the book. I start out as this kind of young, bearded, left bank intellectual in Paris, a pro-Palestinian, going to war as a reporter in Beirut in 1982. And then you see the other picture on the book of me 30 years later as a conservative, pro-American, born-again Zionist Christian who becomes a Republican nominee for Congress, and ultimately even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for my investigations on Iran's nuclear weapons program. And a lot of these things, my journalistic work, you can find at my website, which is kentimmerman.com. It's just my name, kentimmerman.com. And you'll see recently, the most recent piece I did is just a couple of days ago on the Iran nuclear deal and why Biden is so obsessed with getting this deal done before the midterm election. So I invite people to go there. It's from the American Thinker over the weekend.
So I'm going to be a little provocative, and I'm going to challenge you on something that you just said, which is you've just described the media as having deteriorated from intellectual, honorable profession to politically biased institutions. But you describe yourself in the beginning of your journey as a journalist in your memoir as somebody who very much fits the exact stereotype that was apparent, that seems to have been as true then as it is now. So how have things really changed, and how can you say that the profession was honorable if at the time you describe yourself as exactly the type of person who you don't consider honorable now?
Right. You're a very good point, and well said. So when I went to Beirut the first time, I was in that mold and thought that the Israelis were oppressing the poor Palestinians. I was invited by a Palestinian NGO to West Beirut to sort of embed with this NGO and to write stories about the suffering of ordinary people. I had support from Palestinian, quote, ambassadors in Paris and in Athens. I stopped off in Athens on my way to Beirut that summer of 1982 and thought everything was just fine. And the first thing that happened to me when I crossed over into West Beirut during a ceasefire, and I tell the story of the book, is I get picked up by a Fatah political operative and kidnapped, taken off the streets, taken hostage, and held for 24 days in an underground cell where we were bombed day and night. And as a result of that experience, first, I became born again as a Christian. But second, I also learned things about reporting. And I learned about the illusions that I had as a 28-year-old going into this war, which were wrong. And they were preconceived notions, the very notions that you just mentioned that I have condemned myself. I believed I had a narrative in my mind, and reporting is not about a narrative. Reporting is about following facts. What is, I think, wrong with American journalism today is that most media organizations follow a narrative. They do not follow the facts. So I came out of Beirut with this desire to learn the facts. I was thirsty for knowledge. I was thirsty to learn about the different countries I was going to, the factions. These were days before small laptop computers. So I used to travel around with a bunch of 3x5 cards with notes, facts, background on individuals, on political players, on the history of the particular conflict that I was going into, whether it was amongst the Palestinians or it was between the Palestinians and Israel, or whether it was in Syria, whatever. But I would carry these 3x5 cards so I would be able to plug in facts that I knew to be true, and then to research facts that I wasn't aware of yet or was not sure of yet. So I think it is also my own personal evolution away from those illusions, which I was able to identify as illusions. Today, I think many reporters working for what still gets called erroneously, in my view, the mainstream media, because it is not mainstream, they still have those illusions, but they don't realize it. I had those illusions, and ultimately I woke up to it and understood that they were really illusions.
Where do these illusions come from? Where did they come from for you? And it seems to me after 30, 40 years, a lot of these things have not really changed. The same types of illusions continue to penetrate despite shocking experiences of people like you who were literally mocked by reality. So what are these illusions? Where do they come from? Why haven't they been broken by experience?
Yeah. In my case, it was pretty simple. They were from the media around me. I was living in Paris, as I said, a kind of a left bank intellectual at that point, and there was a pretty much of a consensus in the media, even from left to right, about this war in Lebanon. The Israelis were at fault. The Palestinians were the heroes. They were being besieged in West Beirut. It was like Stalingrad. They were heroes, and all of the media was pretty much telling the same story. The media in France was anti-Israel. Okay, and it was difficult to access a different point of view in Paris at that time. So I had to actually go to Beirut to learn on the ground. And you read in my book, and the rest is history, you see how illusion after illusion is kind of falling away from me as I'm getting into this experience of crossing into West Beirut, and then ultimately the unexpected, which was getting taken hostage. But even before being taken hostage, some of those illusions are beginning to fall from my eyes, like scales dropping from my eyes. The Christians, I didn't understand the Christians of Lebanon at that point. Oh my gosh, the Palestinians have been oppressing the Christians for 7 years. They've been bombing Christian households. Oh my goodness, the Palestinians have been going after the Shia of Lebanon. There's a scene earlier on in the book with a dinner with a Shiite member of parliament. And and the dinner, it starts off with cocktails at the home of a Lebanese Christian. And I said, oh, and they kind of laugh at me, these two men. And they say, oh, you're kind of surprised to see a Christian and a Shia Muslim together. In fact, he was staying with a Christian. And I said, wow, that's pretty unusual. He said, well, actually, my home got bombed in West Beirut. And I said, oh, the Israelis bombed? No, he said, the Palestinians bombed my home. And he was a Shiite member of parliament. And I just kind of completely blew my mind away. It kind of shattered one of those illusions that this was a black and white war between bad Israel and good Palestinians. In fact, the Palestinians were the occupiers. They were the ones oppressing people. They were oppressing the Lebanese. They had occupied Lebanon. And the Israelis came in many ways as liberators. Now, I don't think that was necessarily their intention, but that was certainly the feeling of many, many Lebanese on the ground at the time.
Today, we speak a lot about the emergence of Hezbollah as a response to Israeli invasion, but there's not much discussion about the victimization of the Shia and Christians that have brought them closer together. Later on, there's much to say about the corruption of the Christian parties and so forth, and how they lend themselves to this unholy alliance. But this very real mutual experience, that is not something that is widely discussed today, even by critics of Hezbollah, even by critics of Iran's involvement in Lebanon. These grievances are still kind of beside the point, and quite frankly, the role of the Palestinians in Lebanon to this day is still a taboo topic in journalism. In fact, it has
Right.
faded from discussion. Do you think it's still a relevant issue?
It is a relevant issue, and it leads this really this hatred of Lebanese Christians and Shia of the Sunni Palestinians continues to this day. It does not get talked about much, does not get written about. You're absolutely corrupt. And I will fast forward to the second volume of this memoir, which is not released yet. It's called The Iran House, and it's about my dealings with helping the pro-freedom movement in Iran and actually working with Israel to help the pro-freedom movement at a certain point. They dropped that later on. But I became friends with the man who's today the president of Lebanon, Michel Aoun. Then a General Aoun, he came to my house in Washington, D.C. At one point after 9/11. I introduced him to members of Congress and members of the Senate. And Aoun was, even at that time, in a relationship with the Shiite community. He was not anti-Muslim at all. He was anti-Sunni Muslim. He was anti-Sunni Muslim. And you had this, at that time, you had in Lebanon the outside players, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and many, many Christians were much more anti-Saudi than they were anti-Iran. Now, things have changed a little bit, but still, there is that dynamic that's still ongoing. And Aoun explained to me many years later, as he was poised to become elected president finally, that he was going to continue that relationship, which now was a relationship with Hezbollah. I said, that's really a dumb thing to do. Excuse me, mon général, but if you want to have help from the Bush administration, at this point, this was during the George W. Bush administration, you would do better not to have a relationship with Hezbollah. And he said, I don't care. I need Hezbollah against the Sunnis.
So this seems to be like a very simplistic mindset in a country where the entire premise of its existence is based on a careful balance between Sunni, Shia, and Christians. Aoun, from your description, sounds like he did not particularly care about maintaining about that balance, that he cared about a particular power dynamic rather than what was originally envisioned in the political structure of Lebanon. To some extent, that description seems to me applicable to much of what's going on and what has been going on over the decades in the region. There's a lot of talk of balancing the Sunni, Shia, and the rights of the minorities, but in reality, we are seeing that it is never really about balance, and it's more about power domination, and in recent years, specifically by Iran, and with minorities being largely used as pawns or excuses for various interests. How do you think, what was the response to this understanding from the political sphere, including within the conservative movements? Did they really understand what was going on, or did the Sunni Shia dynamic to them seem something far away and not all that relevant?
It's a complicated story, and it's a complicated situation on the ground. I tell stories, and again, in the second volume of this book, about Uri Lubrani, who was Israel's coordinator for Lebanon and later their point man for Iran. He used to say in the 1980s, when Israel was still very deeply involved in Lebanon, and especially allied to the Christian community, people would criticize him and say, well, why are you talking to the Druze? Why are you talking to the Sunnis? Why are you talking to this group and to that group? And he would say, Lebanon is like a piano. You have to play all the notes. And in the United States, I think we never understood it was a piano, let alone being able to play any of the notes. So our administrations would tend to have one ally and not understand that they had to at least understand the other groups inside Lebanon. Now, the good news is the Palestinians have pretty much ceased to be a troubling factor inside Lebanon, because for decades it really was this Palestinian Sunni influence. Now you have a disconnect between Saad Hariri, for example, the former and future prime minister, the son of Rafik Hariri, who I met in Beirut many years ago before he was killed. And he does not have this close tie to the Palestinians that other Sunni leaders have had in the past. So the Palestinians have been sort of extracted, pulled out of that Lebanon equation. And now you have they have been replaced in a way, on a different side, obviously, but by the Iranians directly involved. So now you have Iran directly playing inside Lebanon, and they're very powerful. And today, they pretty much control the country, just as they control a large part of Iraq. So it's a different equation, but it's still complicated. It's still complex. And we tend to like black and white situations in America, and this one is muddied. It's muddied brown and gray.
That's especially astounding considering the controversy over past Syria's involvement in Lebanese affairs that caused a great deal of consternation both in Lebanon internally and in the West. But with Iran's virtual control of the country, there seems to be far less controversy over this idea of Lebanon becoming a puppet state for Iran. Why the difference between Syria and Iran to that effect? Why has there been so much debate about Syria's undue influence there and so little about Iran's?
Well, everybody was talking about the Syrians in the 80s and the early 90s. Bush 41, who I think was a tremendously corrupt president for many different reasons, but he essentially sold out the Lebanese. He was to the Syrians, and he was the one in 1989 when General Aoun was the prime minister. And when General Aoun seemed like a savior for the Christians and for Lebanon in general because he opposed the Syrian occupation, it was Bush 41 that cut a deal with the Syrians and forced Aoun to flee the country with the French, dressed as a woman, and he fled into exile to France, and that's where I ultimately met him. Was in Marseille. In the south of France. He was living in a sumptuous villa right near the American consulate, and the Americans wouldn't talk to him because they'd sold him out. A guy named David Sutterfield, who was then at the State Department, has now become a muckety-muck at the top of the Obama administration for the Middle East policy.
It's funny how the same players seem to be playing their roles over and over again with not much changing over decades of failed arguably foreign policy. But getting back to your personal journey, while you ended up incarcerated by these Fatah activists, you went on a religious journey. How did that come about? How does someone come from completely leftist, secular, ideological views to a religious transformation?
Yeah, I was secular, but I was not anti-Christian. I'd been brought up as a Christian. I had never lost my faith per se. I was just not practicing. I was not reading the Bible, reading Scripture, which I think is very important for us all to do. And as the time went on in that underground cell, which was the size of kind of an ordinary bedroom here in the United States, except that there were 20 people on the ground, on the floor, sleeping. So imagine your bedroom with 20 people in it. You had to step over bodies to get from one side to the other, or when we would have meals together, they would put in bags of dried hummus, the Lebanese flatbread. But I found myself grasping for portions of Scripture that I could still remember from my childhood. And they were a great comfort to me because I had been brought up on the Old Testament with the King James Version, and so some of those phrases would resonate in my mind. And then one day in particular, and this is where I had the kind of conversion moment, if you wish, my road to Damascus. We were in the cell I was there with a French foreign legionnaire who actually. If the Palestinians had known what he had done, they would have killed him right away. But they couldn't figure it out, so they kept him alive to see if they could break him. They never broke him. And a young woman, an American woman, and a young man, probably around my age, their late 20s, early 30s, came down during an air raid. So we were getting bombed. It was, we would say, the door was doing the shake, rattle, and roll, and banging with the bombs, and the building was collapsing. Floors were collapsing above us. We could hear the cement kind of filtering down onto the as one floor would collapse. And so they came down, all smoke and fighters collapsing in a pile kind of out there in this common room. And the Frenchmen began to whistle the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, through the Judas, through this little window in the iron door. And the young American couple didn't budge. Perhaps they didn't recognize it. I don't know. They didn't budge. Then I said, wait a second, they're Americans. And so I said, let's do this. So I started to whistle the Star-Spangled Banner. So we whistled the Star-Spangled Banner. And then the woman freaked out completely. She almost visibly gasped and started to turn around. And the man grabbed her hand and said, don't look over there. Don't look. And I could see what was going on in their minds. They were saying to themselves, well, here we are, quote, friends of the Palestinians. We are being escorted by the Palestinians around. What's the difference between us as Americans and perhaps Americans over there? I said, well, there's a steel door. And we are free and they are not free. Not much difference. One steel door separated them from me, and they were terrified about it. Afterwards, I was taken upstairs and beaten. I describe that in the book. It's a practice called the bastonado, or the bastonnade in French. And the pain was absolutely excruciating. Ultimately, I passed out. And when I was brought back to the cell, just experiencing this mind-numbing pain beyond anything I had ever conceived of, I sensed this presence with me in the cell. And I understood it was Jesus, and he was there on the cross, and I could kind of feel the blood running down and the immense pain that he had undergone 100 times worse than anything I was feeling. And he was kind of looking at me, and I said, oh, wow, you have gone through all of this for me. And it's 100 times worse than what I am feeling right now. And you did that for me. And I cried. It was just an overpowering understanding, comprehension of what he had done for me personally, to save me from my sins and to drag me up out of the darkness. And ultimately, as you'll find out in my book, and the rest is his history, I was literally dragged up from the darkness into the light. And I think it was by angels. God had a plan for me, and it wasn't to die in that cellar in Beirut. It was to come out of it and to give thanks to my risen Lord, and to really to testify to his salvation.
After you finally came out, after you finally saw that you were not going to end it there, what did you have any thoughts about that American pro-Palestinian couple that kind of abandoned? I just can't stop thinking about that incident, because to me it seems absolutely shocking.
Yes, it was shocking, and yes, and I could tell you, number one, I was looking for them for some time, and I would say to myself, if I ever find them, I don't know what I would do. I actually hope I don't find them. But I learned for a fact that they had never gone to the U.S. Embassy. They never informed the U.S. Embassy that there were Americans in this underground Fatah prison. And I knew the Americans didn't know that I was there. They didn't know that I'd been missing. When I went to get a passport, I have you'll see a copy of that passport at the end of the book in the photo section. Pretty gaunt. I look like obviously very young, but also I had lost a lot of weight in 3.5 weeks, and you can see my sunken cheeks. So they had never they never went to the embassy. They never informed them that there's an American who is held hostage by the Palestinians. And later, I learned that the woman who was there, she was actually pretty well known in Beirut. She had a nickname. She was known as the Little Drummer Girl. And she was the one who inspired John le Carre to write a book of the same name, The Little Drummer Girl, about a pro-Palestinian British woman. So he changed her nationality. Her name was Janet Stevens. And all this I learned later. There's a footnote at the end of the story where I kind of put in the history. So my story is what was not the history, and then I put the history in the footnote that people knew about. Janet Stevens went to the U.S. Embassy to plead for aid for the Palestinians on April 18th, 1983. And at that moment, she was sitting in the cafeteria at around noontime. An Iranian agent and an Iranian operative drove a truck through the embassy gates right into the middle section of the embassy and blew himself up, took down the entire middle section of the embassy, and the cafeteria was there on the ground floor. She was at ground zero of that explosion and died in that explosion. I didn't know it at the time. I was one of the first journalists on scene. I was in another part of Beirut at that time, interviewing the former president, Kamin Shamoun, and we heard this boom in the distance. And I said, I kind of went, wonder what that is. He said, oh, young man, that this happens all the time. It must be the multinational force. They're just blowing off some mines that they found out. I said, sir, that seems to me pretty loud. And then the ambulance siren started up, and I said, excuse me, sir, I think we'll have to continue this some other time. And he was very forgiving. And I rushed downstairs, and the fun thing. I mean, Beirut was a wonderful and scary place, but it was a wonderful place as well. And you could always count on the taxi drivers knowing exactly what was going on. So I went down to the street, flagged down a taxi. I said, what happened? He said, it's the U.S. Embassy. I said, well, let's go. And so he drove me directly to the U.S. Embassy. And that's how I was there when they were still dragging people out of the rubble. There were people kind of suspended from electric cables, 4 flights up. And it was an awful, ghastly scene. I described that in the book, and wrote that was my first page 1 story as a reporter, my first front page.
Aside from the horrific irony of those people being, of that woman Janet being there, the other thing that comes to mind is that this was one of the few times where Hezbollah has directly attacked U.S. interests. What was the feeling in the media circles about Hezbollah at the time when that happened? Because I see a lot of the parallels of the kind of activism attitude towards Iran today that woman Janet had for the Palestinians at the time, and frankly, that hasn't gone away from certain circles either. But now Iran has been added to that. Was it the same at the time, or was the sentiment different?
It took a while for people to wake up to the Hezbollah involvement. And again, the chapter in my book is called First Blood. And I argue that this was Iran's first blood against the United States in what turned out to be a very long war. But at the time, we did not realize it. And most of the people that I was talking to at that time, people in the Christian parties, the Phalangist Party, people in government, in the intelligence service, a guy named Simon Cassis, who was the head of the Lebanese Deuxième Bureau, which is their intelligence service, they thought it was the Syrians and the Soviets. So they thought the bomb had been put together inside the Soviet embassy, complete fabrication, absolutely untrue. But for some time, that was the story that was out. And it took a while to begin to appreciate the Iranian involvement. And I think that began later on that year when they hit the US Marine barracks and the French Marine barracks in the same day, the same time, coordinated attacks, 6 minutes between 2 truck bombs, different locations, 6 minutes apart. By the way, that became the signature of the terrorist behind those attacks, Imad Mughniyeh, who was a Lebanese Shiite, but working for Iran. He was, even at that time, he had already graduated to become their military their chief of military operations, and Iran's chief overseas terrorist. And I tracked Imad Mughniyeh for a long, long time. Once I began to learn who he was and learn, his name, the Lebanese. Nobody had photos of him. Well, I got the first photos of him given to me by a French intelligence source. They actually wanted them published, not to know who would give it. So they didn't want me to tell who gave them to them, but they wanted the pictures out there. And even today, when you look at Imad Mughniyeh, there's a passport photo of him as a young man. It's all over the internet. That's my photo. That's the picture I first published in 1988 in a newsletter I had at the time called Middle East Defense News.
Mughniyeh came to play a horrific and destructive role, and we all know how things ultimately went with him. But today, ironically, Iran is one of the main proponents of the so-called Palestinian cause in its most violent iteration. We are also seeing a disturbing pattern of cooperation between Iran and assorted extremist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood. At the time, the narrative seemed much as it still is in some circles today of a strict division between Shia and Sunni interests and power struggles. Was there any evidence that people like Mughniyeh were expanding their reach beyond their immediate sphere?
Yes, and that's something that I investigated first as a reporter, and then later as an investigator for attorneys working for 9/11 victims after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And we discovered a serious pattern of cooperation between Sunni and Shia terrorist groups. Yes, there is a tremendous tension and sometimes hatred between Sunnis and Shia. Yes, the Saudis are rivals with the Iranian regime today in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that. They have a proxy war going on between the two of them in Yemen, a very bloody proxy war going on between the two of them. But when it comes to terrorist operations, when it comes to killing Jews and killing Americans, the Sunni and Shia terrorist groups get along very well, thank you. They get along very well. We discovered, for example, that Imad Mughniyeh was present at a meeting in 1993 in Khartoum, Sudan, which is a Sunni Muslim country, right? And it was run by a Sunni Muslim fundamentalist preacher. He was there at a meeting in Khartoum, 1993, with Osama bin Laden. And bin Laden at that point was an unknown, but he was not unknown to the Iranians. He was not unknown to Hezbollah. And he was there to cement a relationship. Also there were people from the Egyptian Islamic Gamma Islamiyya, the group run by Zawahiri, who later became the #1 of Al-Qaeda and was killed just this past year in an attack by the United States. So that cooperation, that was a pattern of cooperation. And as I started to look more into it, and I wrote a very long affidavit for the attorneys for this, which is that one I think is unclassified. It's unsealed. You can get it at 911case.com. I realized that there actually had been a pattern of cooperation between the Shia Islamic fundamentalist regime in Iran and Palestinian groups in particular, but Sunni Muslim terrorist groups that went back to the 1970s. And I was given photographs by a buddy of mine in Paris who was a well-known Iranian French photographer of the son of Ayatollah Khomeini in South Lebanon in 1979, wearing his his Hujjat al-Islam robes and his turban, with an RPG-7 on his shoulder, training in a Palestinian terrorist camp in South Lebanon. And there were Cubans in the photos. So Cubans, Palestinians, Iranian wannabe revolutionaries in 1975, so 3 years before the Iranian Revolution began. And it was quite a uh, a powerful relationship. And people forget also that the first foreign, quote unquote, leader to visit the revolutionary regime in Tehran, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, was who? Yasser Arafat. Arafat was the first one to visit Khomeini and to give his blessing to the new Shiite fundamentalist regime. So anyhow, so there's a long, long history of Sunni Shia terrorist ties, and it went against the narrative, not just in the media in the United States. We had a great deal of opposition in this lawsuit against Iran from the intelligence community, from the CIA. They pushed back in public. They would tell other journalists, oh, this is just absolute nonsense. Sunnis and Shias eat each other for breakfast. There's no way they could possibly have cooperated on the 9/11 attacks. And for years, that was the narrative in Washington and in the intelligence community. And it was really only after about, I'd say, 2013, and I was lecturing at the JCTA, which is the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy at Quantico on Iran, that a deputy director of the NDIO, the National Director of Intelligence, was there listening to my lecture. And afterwards, she came up to me and said, you know, you're right. We are beginning to re-examine the role that Iran played in assisting al-Qaeda in the 9/11 attacks. And today you'll see it's the Treasury Department talks about it frequently. They talk about al-Qaeda operatives working out of Iran. They had, for many years, had their fundraising operations based in Iran. Saad bin Laden, the son of Osama bin Laden, lived for almost 20 years in Iran before he fled to Pakistan and was killed, and on and on and on. So today it has become a little bit more acceptable, but we had to fight an uphill battle to get the intelligence community, let alone the journalism community, to understand what was actually going on, this alliance between the Islamic Republic of Iran and al-Qaeda. And the Taliban, by the way, and the Taliban, and you know, other Sunni groups, and Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood.
And you also pointed out to another important factor that frequently goes unmentioned, which is the Soviet Union and their proxies. Because the Cubans and the Palestinians and the Fatah activists, they were all Soviet-backed and trained. Now Khomeini, famously post-revolutionary Iran, there was this saying, neither to east to west, that Iran would chart its own course, that it would not align itself either with Western powers or with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which was obviously not the case. There's stories pointing to some of the Ayatollahs literally working for the Soviet Union, speaking fluent Russian, and for sure, my own research has pointed to the Soviet intelligence training of their counterparts in Iran, but all of that became evident after the revolution. What you are sharing right now is the first evidence that the Soviets were involved in cooperation with pre-revolutionary Iranian Islamist Khomeinist groups. That is not something that is discussed at all. It's either people are completely unaware of it or it's another taboo element. And the question is why? Why would the cooperation between the Soviet powers and the Islamic revolutionaries, who very much share the same mindset, not be more over, why wouldn't it have been more of a discussion in the years leading up to the 1979 events? Do you think there was some agenda being covered up that we should probably know about at this point in time?
Absolutely. And again, I was in Paris during the Iranian Revolution. So I would see, in fact, the uncle of my then girlfriend was doing business. He was a businessman in Tehran. He had a bicycle factory, and he would go back and forth during the revolution between Paris and Tehran. And when he was in Paris, he would sleep on our couch. And so we had long, long discussions with him about what was going on at the time in Tehran. And after the revolution, we saw wave after wave of Iranians go into exile, and they would come to Paris, Shapur Bakhtiar, and later Bani Sadr. And I met all these people. I interviewed them. I became friends with many of them. And we could see what was going on at the time. Paris was a very good place to be. But here was the thing, Irina, is that just as the French media embraced the Palestinians, they also embraced Khomeini. They were in love with Ayatollah Khomeini for all kinds of different reasons. You had the Holombot kind of people, the left-wing really Marxist intellectuals, the left bank intellectuals who embraced Khomeini as an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist. And they believed this neither East nor West, which, by the way, was a fiction. It was a total fiction. And you'll read in my book, and the rest is history, why it was a total fiction. Because there was a play. The Soviets were making a very big play to turn Iran and bring Iran into their camp during the revolution itself, and later on during the Iran-Iraq War. And part of IranContra was an effort to block that, to stop that. Again, that's in the book. You can read that. But the media was in love with that revolution. And by the way, the media in the United States still is. The Democrat Party still is. Despite the debacle of the hostage crisis in 1979, despite the fact that Jimmy Carter, Democrat president, lost the presidency because of his weakness during the hostage crisis, despite all of that, you have Joe Biden, John Kerry, the people now running the State Department, the people now running the negotiations with Iran, in bed with the Iranian regime. They love this regime. Biden and Kerry both took money from the pro-Tehran lobby, NIAC, during their political campaigns, and they have done so for 20 years, and quite openly. John Kerry, his wife, married an Iranian American whose family is plugged in to the regime, and they went, I believe it was actually on their honeymoon to Tehran to meet all the family members, and this in the 2004 2005 time period. So there is this, I don't know, this embrace of the left. Remember, Teddy Kennedy was in love with the communists. Was in love with the Soviet Union. Traveled to Moscow and was trying to undermine President Reagan with help from the Soviet Union and from the KGB. So the left has long been in bed with enemies of America, and I think that continues today.
Today's Iran's cooperation with Russia should come as no surprise, because Putin comes from the very same KGB apparatus, as has had a very fruitful relationship with the Iranian intelligence services for decades. There's been geopolitical tensions between the two countries. There's been geopolitical rivalries for sure, but there's also been a great deal of tactical cooperation that is virtually unknown today, because for whatever reason, that topic has never been really publicly breached. Soviet Iranian intelligence joint efforts and what happened afterwards. But clearly this has been in the making for decades. Today's events, the political bloc that we're seeing forming, that includes some of these post-Soviet or semi-Soviet countries and Iran and its proxies. We are seeing that cooperation come out into the open rather than just become newly formed. And this is not a reality that Americans are familiar with, just because their entire perception of the Cold War has been that of a bipolar period, us versus the communists, which was never really the case. We are seeing that the Islamist groups that we thought we were cultivating against the communists were in fact working closely with our enemies all along in some respects. So coming back to this fraud that was sold to the general public, that we were basically conned into taking particular postures along with these groups. How do you explain that today the same plays, as with the Taliban specifically, continue to work their magic on the public imagination? And we've seen both Democrat and Republican administrations use these comments, simplify the narrative, ignore these undercurrent realities, and play off different actors in the public view for political reasons against each other, even as they are closely aligned against us. How do we explain this Washington Beltway, Democrat narrative not having broken to this day, because I don't really see much difference between two parties at the end of the day, not on a strategic level.
Right. So when I came back to the United States, and I described this and the rest is history, I came back in '93 when Clinton first took office. And I still believe, because I had lived overseas for 18 years by this point, I still believed that our political differences as Americans stopped at the nation's shores. Well, I was wrong. I was completely wrong. And that was yet another illusion that fell from me many years after those initial illusions in Lebanon. The political differences do not stop at our nation's shores. And we have, as we've seen with John Kerry in particular during the Trump administration, going overseas, talking to Iranians, in coaching the Iranian foreign minister not to cave in to any of Trump's demands. Don't worry, help is going to be on the way for you, the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran. We, the Democrats, are going to help you. I mean, that is treasonous. That is just openly treasonous. And by the way, there's a lot worse than that actually happened during the Trump administration with the Democrats. I can tell you right now, there were efforts by the entourage of candidate Joe Biden to encourage Iran to attack the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Baghdad over Christmas of 2019, and those efforts were aimed at creating a new hostage crisis, or a new Benghazi, if you wish, for President Trump to undo his re-election effort in 2020. And the only reason those efforts did not succeed, because they had planned it out, they were all working together on this, was because Trump, independently of that, got word that Qasem Soleimani was involved in that embassy, that attempt to storm the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. He was ginning up crowds of 20,000, 30,000. They were on the march and coming to the embassy. Trump, unlike the Democrats, flew hundreds of U.S. Marines up from Kuwait to defend the embassy. And then he got Qasem Soleimani. And once he got Qasem Soleimani, he took him off the chessboard. It was all over. So, you know, why does that happen? Why do you have a political party? And I happen to think this is only on the Democrat side. Remember, for years and years and years, decades even, the Democrats were trying to prove an October surprise by Bill Casey and Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush during the 1980 election campaign. And they claimed for years and years, they held hearings in Congress that stretched over a decade on this. Or stretch over 5 years, excuse me. They were still going on in 1992 when I was preparing to move to Washington. They claimed that Reagan and Casey were holding secret talks with the Iranians to prevent the hostages from being released until the elections. So Reagan could use that as an election issue. Completely, totally false. And I know it's completely, totally false because I spent several years investigating it, thinking it was true. Bonnie Sauter, the former president, I knew him very well in Paris at that point, and he was banging on this drum and banging on the drum and saying they met with this one, they met with that one, and all the rest. It was completely, totally false, complete disinformation. But you had one party on the American political spectrum that was willing to commit treason in order to win an election victory back here at home. It's really hard to believe.
So here I am hearing completely shocking information. Qasem Soleimani is thankfully dead and gone, but at the time, the usual suspects were claiming that we would have a major war with Iran in the event that that this happened. Obviously, that did not materialize, although Iran has subsequently tried to murder Americans on U.S. soil as revenge for its own weakness at the time. What I'm not hearing is about what happened to the American entourage that was encouraging Iranians to do exactly that. Why have this story not broken during the Trump administration? And why hasn't anyone been investigated and put on trial for very clearly, treasonous and malicious activity?
what I can tell you at this point, and I can also say that I will be talking more about this when I am able to do so more freely. But what I can tell you is that those same individuals are today in the highest levels of our national security establishment, including in the White House itself.
Still mind-boggling that they were ever allowed to get as far as they did, especially considering that the public was not privy to that shocking information. And of course, given what you just told me, it's no surprise that they're continuing to behave as they are now, since they weren't stopped when, before they got to the positions of power. Getting back to the 80s, to Lebanon, to France, and to all these things going on. On the one hand, we have this horrific Hezbollah attack on the U.S. interests. On the other hand, we have other things going on. We have abductions such as the abduction of the U.S. Intelligence, Buckley, back in the day, and torture and so forth. We have IranContra and the efforts to stop Iranians, which did not really work the way President Reagan hoped it would, in part because the whole thing may have been a con, an attempt to dupe US into taking a particular course of action. But all of these events were lessons for the way the region operates, for the way certain interests align. You mentioned in your book talking about these terrorists, these spies, but most importantly, crooks and dupes. Now, a lot of the story is just as much about fake outs and fake news and disinformation and deception as it is about terrorism and extremist ideology and clever intelligence operations by organized groups. A lot of it is just about characters who wander in and and hijack the situation. Could you tell us a little bit more? Because I'm seeing a lot of it to this day, and yet we don't seem to understand the pattern of how that can possibly happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I got involved in IranContra before it was known as IranContra, and through the auspices of a former CIA operative, a guy named Paul Skekloka Cutter. He was Serbian origin, and a colonel in the U.S. Army, Mark Broman, who was the director of what was called the Office of Defense Cooperation in Paris, gigantic office at 55 Rue La Boétie, which was also the CIA annex station, was the embassy annex. So the agency was there, the ODC was there, Brumman was there with an enormous office, and they set up a defense trade company, arms dealers. They set up a company to sell arms, and also a publishing venture. So I got in through the publishing side of this. They had a series of defense magazines, and I became an expert on the French defense industry. Thanks to this, was visiting defense factories and started to go to trade shows, the air shows and this show and that show, and was meeting people in the industry, but also got involved early on in 1984 in an effort to sell Egyptian F-4 fighter aircraft, I thought, to Paraguay. And so they sent me down to, because I had been in Egypt, I had lived in Egypt for a while, and I tell that story in the book, and building a hospital. I was there building a hospital and learning Arabic at the time. And so they sent me to Egypt in early 1984 with what's called an end-use certificate, an EUC, from the head of the Paraguayan Air Force. And they sent me to meet with the General Usri Khatib, who was the head of what we would call the DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, in charge of all Egyptian weaponry that they were trying to get rid of, because they're going to bring new weapons in. They were buying F-16s from the United States, and so they wanted to get rid of these F-4s. So I went to him. He was very, very congenial, very friendly. I was introduced by Colonel Broman's his counterpart at the U.S. Embassy in Egypt, in Cairo. All this was up, all on the up and up, and the U.S. government was behind it, so I was told. And General Usri looks at this Paraguayan EU certificate, and he says, Paraguay, huh? Very interesting. Does Paraguay have an air force? And I said, well, General, I sure think they do, but let me check and get back to you. So we ended the first meeting, and I stopped off at the hotel, changed out of my suit, and then went to the American University of Cairo library and looked up in the CPRI catalog about military expenditures and armed forces worldwide, looked up Paraguay and said, let's see, their air force consists of, I think it was 10 single engine prop planes that we would use as trainers, and maybe a half a dozen jet fighters from the 1960s. And I said, boy, this sale would be, it was then $132 million, I remember. This sale would be the same as the entire budget of the government of Paraguay. I went back to see General Khatib the next day, and I said, well, sir, looks like you were right. There may be a problem with this Paraguay end-use certificate. Let me go back to Paris, and thank you very much for your time and for your business. Let me go back to Paris and check this out and see what it's all about. So I go back to Paris, and I confront, this Colonel Broman. He was still in his office at the U.S. Embassy, so he was still an active duty U.S. government official and a colonel in the U.S. Army. And I said, you lied to me. And he said, shh, not here. So we went out to a cafe to talk. And I said, this isn't for Paraguay. He said, no, of course it's not for Paraguay. You didn't understand that? And I said, no, I didn't understand that. It's for Iran, isn't it? He said, of course it is, you dummy, basically. And I said, my God, this is crazy. I don't want to be involved in selling F-4s to Iran. They're completely nuts. And so I started taking notes from then on and saving documents. And I got involved and got to know many of the other players, including this Paul Skekloka Cutter, who was quite a character, and I describe him at length in the book. He would breeze through Paris in between going to Israel and South America and other places to close all these arms deals, and we got very, very close. I worked out a deal with CBS 60 Minutes to do an undercover story on this, so they had me all wired with a cameraman in the Paris Hilton behind the potted trees, and I was wired with microphones and everything. And the guy, in the end, he never showed up. He was supposed to show up. He was arrested a year and a half later in an operation by U.S. Customs that had nothing, that took me completely by surprise. But here's what I think is most important about this. I mean, those characters are a lot of fun, and those passages about IranContra and the Damovan project and the rest is history are really just a lot of fun to read. But there's also a very serious element behind it. Is that the Frenchmen who were opening the doors to the Iranians at that point, including a guy named Bernard Veillot, a former French Navy pilot. And he considered himself to be very pro-American and also a French patriot. And he said, I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because it is the right thing to do, and here's why. And he went on to explain that there was a battle going on. This goes back to our earlier discussion about the Soviets. There's a battle going on inside the Iranian Air Force between a pro-Soviet faction and a pro-American faction. Remember, the Americans had cut off arms supplies to Iran once the Ayatollah took over. They got embroiled in a war with Iraq. They could not find the spare parts for their F-4s and their F-14 aircraft. So their Air Force was essentially grounded. And the Iraqis were being supplied both by the Soviet Union and by the French, increasingly by the French. And so there was a battle inside the Air Force of influence. Do we try to make a deal with the Americans to get spare parts for our Air Force? Or the other side said, no, forget that. It's not going to happen. Let's just turn to the Soviets, who are offering to sell us, to completely re-equip the Army, the armed forces, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. Now, for people who don't follow the arms trade, the reason this is important, Irina, is because Soviet weapons and American weapons work on completely different systems. The training is different, the actual equipment is different, even the tools are different, the maintenance is different. And there are no spare parts that are interchangeable. You can't put a part from a MiG-29 and put it on an F-16. You couldn't put a part from a MiG-23 and put it on an F-4. Just it just didn't happen, wouldn't work, just would not work. So if the pro-Soviet faction won out, they would essentially shut out the American trained officers, the pro-American officers who remained in the Air Force and in the armed forces. And by the way, they did, and some of them are still there to this day, fewer and fewer. But they would shut out that pro-American faction. So in the beginning, the way it was explained, it was called the initiative. And the initiative was to do strategic deals with Iran to help them with limited spare parts, Harpoon missiles in particular, but spare parts for the F-4s and some of the F-14s, to enhance the influence of that pro-American faction inside the armed forces. Later, very quickly, that was IranContra was substituted for that initiative. And as I put it in another book that I wrote about this, called Countdown to Crisis, the coming nuclear showdown with Iran, which you can actually get for, I think $2 on my website in a Kindle version, in an ebook version. You go to kentimmerman.com. It's again, a never told story of the U.S.-Iran relationship, the undercover relationship between the U.S. and Iran. But what I say is that the generals essentially took over what the colonels had started. And to get the colonels out of the way, they had them all arrested. So they gave information to U.S. Customs and rolled up these arms networks that I had been involved in. Rolled them all up, arrested the people, threw them in jail. Later, once IranContra was made public in late '86, I think it was in mid '87 or so, Paul Cutter, who was then in jail in a prison in the U.S., filed a new appeal to be released, saying, hey, I told you all along what I did was authorized. See, they were doing it too. The White House was doing it. And ultimately, he was released. He was released. The judge accepted his argument that the United States government was doing exactly what Paul Cutter had been trying to do.
That's quite crazy, to put it mildly. It seems to me that as much as of a scandal as it was then, today we're doing so, we are trading with the authoritarian, with the adversarial regimes quite openly. And when we're not trading with them, we're just leaving mountains of weapons behind for them to take for free. As was the case in Afghanistan, which I still haven't found a good argument for why and how that came about. I've heard different versions, but I'm not sure that I buy into them completely. But I wanted to ask you something which struck me about your story so far. A lot of the comparisons here between your initial situation could be drawn to the journalists who've been abducted recently by various terrorist factions in Syria and so forth. Those of them who've made it out alive, in some cases that have sued Iran and other groups, but in other cases they've gone completely dark. I have no idea who even those journalists were. I don't have the full list of everyone who's been abducted, much less survived, or what happened to them afterwards. You, on the other hand, went back into the field to do your work. What motivated you to stay involved? Did your faith have anything to do with that? And did it color your journey from then on, your professional attitude? And if so, how?
Yeah. Well, certainly my faith did have part of that. I understood that God had a plan for me. And as I said, it wasn't to die in a basement in Beirut or to get buried alive in Beirut. And there are many other cases, stories that I tell, and the rest is history of close calls where I believe I had a whole company of angels assigned to me by the Lord to watch over me, because again, his plan was not for me to die on some stinking battlefield or some rotting cellar in the Middle East, but was to live, to be able to tell stories, to be able to testify to my faith, and to perhaps encourage or motivate younger journalists that you can be an honorable You can exercise this profession in an honorable fashion, and it does not necessarily mean that you stick to what everybody is telling you is moral and right. And there's several cases in my book where I do things that journalists today would tell you are absolute no-no. Oh my gosh, that's disqualifying. That's terrible. How could you possibly have conceived of doing that? I did a story with Mike Wallace of CBS 60 Minutes. This was after the first Persian Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq. And I was one of a handful of non-government experts around the world who understood Saddam's WMD programs, because I'd been there on the ground. I had interviewed the heads of those programs in the 1980s. They had really opened up a lot, obviously not the secrets, but they had opened up the depth of their knowledge and the extent of their contacts worldwide. And so I understood a lot about those programs, was working with the UN arms inspectors and helped them. I had a map of that. It was on the back of my book on this, called The Death Lobby: How the West Armed Iraq. It was a map of all the different weapons plants, and I had a database which I had put together. I was one of the first people to do data-driven journalism, where I would track Middle East industrial sales to see what kind of equipment from what company in Germany and Spain and France and the United States and elsewhere was going into what particular state establishment in Iraq, because they were all called state establishments at that time. And I did the same thing with Iran. I did the same thing with Iran, did the same thing with Libya and with North Korea. And now I kind of lost the thread of where I was going with this, but remind me of your question, and I'll get back to it in just a second.
But the question was, what made you stay in the profession
So what made me stay?
after the torture and so forth, and not,
So I started off by talking about my faith, but it was also getting bitten by the bug. I got bitten by the bug of the Middle East, and I just kept going back, and it was an understanding that the black and white explanations that I was getting of what was happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis just weren't true. There were really no good guys at that point. The Israelis were doing bad things in the West Bank, and the Palestinians were doing horrible things also in the West Bank and in Lebanon and elsewhere. And I wanted to go get ground truth. So I kept going back to Lebanon. And once the wackos, at that point Hezbollah, blew up the bar in the Commodore Hotel in February of 1984, I said, that's it. It's all over. If they don't respect the booze, bad things are going to happen. And so then I started going to Iraq. And sure enough, right after that happened, they started taking hostages for real, seriously. The CNN reporter first, they killed the president of the American University of Beirut, and then they took Bill Buckley, William Buckley, the CIA station chief. And by the way, he was kidnapped and personally interrogated by Imad Mugniye, personally tortured by Imad Mugniye. And that's something that led Bill Casey, the CIA director, and Ronald Reagan to press forward a secret war with Iran in the 80s that was ultimately unsuccessful.
This is the question that plagues me to the day. Why did the country that was able to easily defeat the Soviet Union through arms race, or at least militarily collapses, politically, I'm still convinced we never really won the war, but militarily, for sure, we had what it took. How is it that with Iran that did not work out? And what can we learn about it for today, when our capabilities are significantly greater than they were in the 80s? And
well, I argue in the book that those two explosions in Beirut, the embassy in April of 83 and then the Marine barracks in October of 83, our failure to respond to them militarily sent a message to the Iranians: hey, you can do whatever. You can hit the Americans and they're not going to strike back. They're not going to strike back at you. And many, many years later, I found out, this is actually after 9/11, I found out exactly what happened. I was at that time I was working, with these lawyers, but I was also working at the Washington Times, and there was a court case against Iran from by some of the family members of the 241 U.S. Troops, soldiers, Marines, and corpsmen who were killed in that Marine barracks bombing in October of 1983. At that hearing, the former chief of naval operations, Ace Lyons, Admiral Ace Lyons, got up and he presented a sealed envelope to the judge. And he said, "Your Honor, inside this envelope, which I submit to you under seal, not to be revealed here in public, is the absolute proof that the Iranians were behind the Marine barracks bombing. And I can describe to you a little bit what it says without going into it in detail, but this is an intercept which we picked up 2 weeks before the attacks, and it was not delivered to us until 2 weeks after the attacks. And I can tell you, I wanted, and it was an intercept from essentially Tehran to their ambassador, Mohtashemi, in Damascus, Syria, ordering him to pull out the stops and to attack the US Marines in Beirut. Ace Lyons was involved in what was supposed to be a joint counterstrike with the French government against Iranian forces in Baalbek, which is in the central plain, the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And that attack was to take place roughly mid-November. I was coming back from Tripoli, Lebanon, and I described this in the book, a very crazy little war, even by Lebanese standards, between Palestinian factions. And we'd go up there in the morning from Beirut, take a taxi up to 3 hours up the coastal highway, report for 4 or 5 hours, and then when we had enough, we'd get a taxi back and file our dispatches at night. And if you were lucky, you could get out at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and then we'd stop at a restaurant up in the mountains and have a late lunch and a couple of bottles of wine or whatever. So I was there with a buddy who was from then Czechoslovakia. So then a then Soviet bloc correspondent, very good guy named Vaclav. We became really best buddies. And so his story's in the book. I won't go into that now, but he's quite a character as well. So we were up in this restaurant, and all of a sudden we see up in the air I think it was 5 fighters. We hear them in the distance, and then we get up and kind of look, and I said, "Those aren't Americans." He said, "No, what do you think they are?" And I says, "Those are French super-étendards." And in fact, it is the entire fleet of them up there, all 5. That's all they can fit on an aircraft carrier. For whatever reason, the French were not very good at that point. And they're headed that way towards Syria. What's going on? We went back to our lunch, ordered another bottle of wine, and 20 minutes later, here they come back, the same 5 aircraft, and they're going back out to sea. And I said, something must have just happened. So we pay the bill, go downstairs, get in the car, turn on the radio, and within a half an hour, we learned that the French had just bombed the Sheikh Abdullah barracks in Baalbek, which is where the Iranian Revolutionary Guards were headquartered. A week or 2 after that, we learned that they didn't kill anybody except for a shepherd and a couple of sheep, because there'd been a leak from the French Foreign Ministry to the Iranians a half an hour ahead of time, and the Iranians evacuated the barracks. Now, that's what happened at the time. All these years later, in 2003, Ace Lyons is testifying, and afterwards I went and sat down with him to get the full story from him. And here's what I learned. The US and the French were supposed to go together in that raid. Our jets were on the catapults were attached, they were gassed up, the bombs were loaded on our F-14s, ready to go. And at the last minute, Caspar Weinberger calls up Ace Lyons, chief of naval operations, and said, the deal's off, the raid's off, we're not going. And he said, "Why not, sir?" He says, "We don't have evidence. We don't have evidence that the Iranians were behind this. And besides, if we attack an Arab country, our Arab allies are going to go nuts. It's going to destroy all of our alliances around the world." And I said, "Well, Ace, you had the intercept. You knew that the Iranians were there. By that point, this was 2 weeks after, you knew by that point that the Iranians were behind it. How could Weinberger possibly say they weren't?" He said, "Well, I don't know what happened," but he didn't know. So I talked to the then Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, who became a commissioner on the 9/11 Commission. We became friends, and he told me the same story. He had seen the intercept. So then I interviewed the John Vesey, who at that time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I said, yeah, I saw the intercept. And then I talked to Weinberger. Weinberger said, no, I never saw it. Never saw that intercept. Never heard about it. Nobody ever told me. And so I was trying to figure out what went on. And then I learned that there's an individual in the office of the Secretary of Defense known as the military aide. And the military aide is essentially his chief of staff. And it's the military aide who controls the paper flow to the secretary, who controls what he sees and what he doesn't see from the intelligence community. And the military aide blocked Weinberger. He blocked the intercept. He would not deliver the intercept to Weinberger because he thought this would start a war with Iran. If we attacked Iranian forces in Baalbek, in Lebanon, it would start a war with Iran. And he blocked it from Weinberger, so Weinberger couldn't see it. Who was the military aide? A colonel named Colin Powell.
No.
I tried for years to interview Powell about this. I sent him written questions, called his aides, called his press people, did everything, even after he had left government. Never would answer a single question about this. And I believe that the failure of the US to strike back at Iran at that time in November of 1983 was a strategic failure that ultimately led to this ongoing war with the Islamic regime in Tehran. They are still fighting us today. They are killing our troops wherever they can. They tried to take over the US embassy, remember, just 2 years ago. They've been sending missiles against our forces in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan. This year, they continue to do it today. They killed over 600 US troops in Iraq with explosively formed penetrators in the 2000s. They put bounties on the heads of US troops in Afghanistan, encouraging the Taliban to kidnap and murder American troops. If we had fought back, if we had retaliated in November of 1983, all of that would never have happened.
But that brings us to more recent events, such as the attack on the Aramco, which US refused to attribute to Iran for exactly the same types of reasons. Isn't that the repetition of the same mistakes, knowing exactly how things would play out? And things did play out exactly as the same way after the Aramco attack, where Iran was let off the hook and we continued the same half-hearted effort to strike back against symbolic proxy targets.
That's correct. And remember, Colin Powell was Secretary of State at the beginning of that. And you had a group of people at CIA and the Department of Defense who believed this same line, that if we struck back at the Iranians, it would be war. And we could not afford to fight a war with Iran. They didn't say the regime. We cannot afford to fight a war with Iran. And their argument was people would rally around the flag if we struck Iran. And by the way, that point of view was not limited to the United States. Mayor Dagan, who was the chief of Mossad up until 2010 when he was fired by Bibi Netanyahu, and I happened to meet earlier on, about a couple of years before he was named chief of Mossad, Dagan believed that as well. And he had a furious argument with Netanyahu, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, between 2008 and 2010 over military strikes on Iranian nuclear weapons plants. Dagan was absolutely dead set against it. And he argued that this would make Iranians rally around the flag, support the regime if the Israelis attacked. And ultimately, he won the argument and Israel did not attack.
But would it really matter even if they did? Because at the end of the day, it's the military and the security apparatus that holds the tanks, that holds the weapons, and whether the people rally around them or not has nothing to do with decisions whether those deadly capabilities should be allowed to exist or not. It's not like those people who don't have those weapons can really add anything more than what the military and the security apparatus has. Okay, so they, even if they oppose, even if they're against it, even if they rally around it, what would they really add? That's the argument that seems to be not
Right.
really.
Right. That's a common sense argument. What can I say? That is a common sense argument that is not prevalent inside the intelligence community, and that is not prevalent inside the
They
military.
seem
They
to
have
be
this myth,
terrified of people who cannot get rid of the regime for their own
right, who have no
interest.
power.
And yet somehow they're going to fight the US. How? Or Israel? How? Where?
Right.
You know, those who
Well,
want to be recruited by their security services are already being recruited anyway, so it's not like there's a big difference. But I want to end with one last question, which is as pertinent today as it was then, which is about dealing with the sources in these complicated scenarios, terrorists, intelligence officers, and people of various backgrounds that have their own agendas, that are prone to lying or or if not directly lying, then deceiving by omission or otherwise being manipulative and deceptive. This is a lesson that for today, because you've had an opportunity to interview a wide variety of sources throughout your career, to write books, and of course you've encountered all these characters in real life and had relationships with some of them. How did you draw the line between your personal relations and your ability to objectively tell the truth, and furthermore to even to put aside biases, preconceptions, agendas that were being forced upon you to get the information that you thought would fit, and not just the information that was being pushed to you or that fits some narrative.
that's an important question. It's a very good question. Basically, how do you cut through the bullshit? You know, where's your
Exactly.
bullshit detector? Where's your bullshit detector? And I guess it's almost like a sixth sense when you can tell when somebody's lying to you. You can tell when they are trying to put one over on you. Let me give you an example. Ahmad Chalabi, who became absolutely despised by the US intelligence community, despised by the CIA, despised by the State Department, and ultimately despised by the American media. Why? Because the State Department and the CIA were talking to the media and saying, oh, this guy's an Iranian agent. He's terrible. Ahmad Chalabi was never an Iranian agency. Why do I know that? Because I knew him for 14 years before any of the things that we talk about with Ahmad Chalabi happened. I first met him in 1989 in London. And I knew him intimately. I knew him. We talked hundreds of times together. I knew his family background in great detail. I did a profile of him for Reader's Digest that kind of went into that. And yes, Ahmad Chalabi had an office and a house, I believe, even in Tehran. Of course he did. He had no other way of getting into Iraq, for crying out loud, for all those years that they were based when Saddam was still in power, and they were based in northern Iraq up in Kurdistan. The only way to get into the country, he couldn't go through Turkey because the Turks would arrest him. The only way he could get in was through Iran. So of course he had to go back and forth. Did he talk to the Iranians? Yes, he talked to the Iranians. He had to talk to them. They're his neighbors. Do the Iraqis in government today talk to the Iranians? Of course they do. So those two things, to me, were not disqualifying because there was a perfectly rational explanation for what he was doing. So some of the stories that he told me, and he presented defectors to me who had information on WMD, and he never told me, I vouch 100% for this person's information. He said, Ken, here's what he said, or Ken, please come and talk to him, and you make up your mind. Ahmad never tried to tell me what to report or what to believe. He said, you check it out with your own sources and see what you think. That is completely the opposite of the way he's been portrayed in the media. And because of that, I felt that Chalabi was somebody credible. I would listen to him, certainly. When he had information, I would say, you know, he is certainly very well plugged in. And I would use it to then check and double check and piece it together with other bits of information. In the beginning, what we did The reason I got to know him, I was working for Kroll Associates, whose client at that point was the government of Kuwait. And their country was occupied, and they were trying to track Saddam Hussein's overseas hidden assets. And Chalabi had a lot of information on that. I did as well for my own investigations, and I write about this in And the Rest is History. And so we had that kind of professional relationship to start with. And I'd go back and forth to London to meet him in this tiny little office in Knightsbridge. And that deepened over time, and we became very, very good friends. We would go to his house many times for dinner in Georgetown, my wife and I, our children, anyhow. So Chalabi is a perfect example of this. You have to look at the way a source, a person behaves over time. You can tell if they're trying to spin you, or if they're not, or if they're telling you the truth. These are instincts and skills that you develop as a reporter, and I don't think I have been spun very many times successfully. I think I've seen through most of it. There's maybe one or two chances where I bought into a piece of information that wasn't correct. The problem is always secrecy. So when you're getting access to, quote, secret information, that is the hardest thing of all. That's why the intelligence community, when it goes rogue, or when it becomes an enemy of the state, as I think has happened now in the United States, they are so dangerous, is because under this cloak of secrecy, they can then leak to reporters and create a narrative that the reporters will then reproduce. Donald Trump being a Russian agent. Well, where'd you learn that? Well, we have our sources. We had sources at the highest levels of the intelligence community. Oh, you mean you had those bullshit artists who are trying to tell you a big tall tale, and you fell for it because it was, quote, secret. So there's a problem with that. The secrecy, I think, is one of the biggest problems we have in government. Clearly, their need to keep things secret. I am not against legitimate secrets, but even John Radcliffe, the former NDI, National Director of Intelligence, or Director of National Intelligence, says this publicly. He says there's so much stuff that's classified that never should be, and the only reason it is to cover up the mistakes made inside the intelligence community or by policymakers. You classify it, the public won't see it.
But that's precisely why the need for quality investigative journalists is higher than ever before, and yet the funding for that is not just there. There's plenty of funding for propaganda, for hackery, for self-perpetuating narratives, but not for people who will double check even government sources and do their own investigations based on the secret information. That's just because someone gives you something doesn't mean you shouldn't check it or try to evaluate it.
Right.
In fact, that's the very reason you should ask yourself why
you should try to
this.
That's right. Absolutely.
Given the government doesn't like to give anything for free.
All right. That's absolutely right. Ronald Reagan's the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government. I'm here to help you.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure, and I hope that everyone here will read not only your newest book and your tale of an adventure that will rival any swashbuckling film or story, but of course your other books that present the history that will help them understand what we are seeing today. And the more I delve into these foreign affairs, the more I understand that we cannot understand the politics of today, the current events, without seeing and understanding the history behind them. And to the quality journalism is of tremendous value in trying to understand what's really going on.
That's true. Thank you so much, Irina. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I can't believe we've been talking for over an hour and a half. It went by very quickly.
It was wonderful. For everyone watching, stay tuned for the next Washington Outsider Report. As usual, next Tuesday, 9 p.m. This was the Washington Outsider Report with Irina Zuckerman, and Ken Timmerman was our guest.